There aren't that many video game companies that are as polarizing as Bloober Team is for the video game industry. They release games which are either loved or straight up hated by the gaming community. Those that dislike their work describe their games as bloated, glorified walking simulators, toddler-level scary, and ultimately just are very boring and aren't deserving of their hype. Those who enjoy their releases disagree, stating that their games are less about the game itself and more about the metaphor of the soul. They believe that everything is meticulously crafted in order to convey the concepts of the game, therefore requiring it to go further than what's visually there. Personally, I feel like both sides are actually accurate. Their games are indeed long, repetitive, simplistic, and not really scary visually, but I also can't deny that their games speak to me on a personal level. What I find frightening are the concepts being explored and the method of which they tell their story, which to me is far more interesting than the steps required to achieve them. One thing no one can deny for sure is whether they deserve it or not, Bloober Team grew rapidly as a company, releasing bigger and bigger games whenever they could, which probably caught the attention of Konami. That and the medium seems to me like their proof of concept to convince Konami and lending them the IP. The whole game is about you forcing to interact between the world of the dead and the living simultaneously while trying to uncover the forgotten past that relates to the protagonist somehow. There are indeed worse ideas that were currently part of the Silent Hill license, so I totally see it as an unlicensed game of the saga. But we'll get to that in another video. I decided it was the perfect time to revisit their games and see what we should be worried about with them handling the IP. I know that a lot of gamers are anxious about their involvement, and I want to see if there's some merit to it. I'm hoping that by analyzing their history and subsequently their games, we can identify their strengths and weaknesses in order to adjust our expectations for a game that, let's face it, it just won't lift our expectations. There's just no way that's gonna happen. It's also not their fault because that game has existed for so long that it has become a treasured masterpiece to us. There is just no way that they can compete with something that's been out there for so long. But on the flip side is that we're so attached to the idea of what Silent Hill is to us on a subjective level that there's no way that anything anyone makes can come anywhere near to that level of expectation. That's why I think that there's no better way to tempering our expectation than by having a clear idea of who's making it. That ultimately means that this will be a multi-video series where every game will be extensively examined, dissected, and analyzed. We'll go over their history, their interviews, the public perception, while covering the different game elements like gameplay, graphics, symbolism, and more, to finally arrive at the conclusion where I'll present my final thoughts on the game. This is definitely going to be a long one, so please just sit tight and grab yourself something to drink. I welcome you to the dissecting table, and today we're taking a look at their less controversial game and the game that actually started it all, which is Layers of Fear. This might actually surprise some of you, but Layers of Fear is not actually their first game. Layers of Fear was released on February 16, 2016, but the company was actually funded in 2008. They mostly worked on small projects they usually reviewed poorly and didn't really fall on anyone's radar. We made a lot of different kinds of games for publishers and other developers as it worked for a higher producer, stated Piotr Babiano, the CEO of Bloober Team, during an interview with VentureBeats. Then our main shareholders, the VC, decided to put us on the stock exchange in Poland. Of course, they told us, guys, you have to focus on something small. You have to focus on something that can do well in the market. So we did. They therefore decided to create a new IP that would release early in the PlayStation 4 lifecycle called Basement Crawl. It was a Bomberman clone where your goal was to place bombs in strategic places which would explode in multiple directions after a few seconds had passed. The goal would be to essentially destroy the other players in order to be the only one standing. Needless to say, the game was extremely poorly received with a Metacritic score of only 27%. It was a disaster. However, from a financial standpoint of view, it wasn't so bad. There were maybe 12 to 15 games on the PS4, depending on the region of course, so if someone had the console, it was likely that they'd choose our title. From a financial standpoint of view, it was good for our shareholders, but we were very disappointed at the quality, and we were very disappointed about the perception of the company and our brand. Surprisingly enough, they actually meant it. Most companies would abandon the game and move on to other projects, but not them. They released a public letter apologizing to the general poor quality of the game and promised that they would fix it in the coming months. That's actually where the story gets interesting. They didn't just fix the game as much as they made an entirely new game and published it under the name Brawl on April 24th, 2015. They gave a free copy to anyone who owned the original game as compensation, and fans enjoyed it. You expect a game developer to do a patch. You expect a game developer to do some form of DLC, but you don't expect a developer that will give you a whole game for free. It wasn't great from a financial point of view, but it was great that people realized that we cared. The game was also an important pivoting point for the company. That's the moment where they reflected on themselves and realized that all they did since their creation was following trends and working on other people's titles. They didn't have any fame because they were trying to copy other projects to which they simply couldn't match the quality. We decided we needed to focus on what we felt would be good for us. We got back to the roots of why we moved into the gaming industry. We always liked horror, psychological horror. We were reading a lot of books and watching a lot of movies. We wanted to work on games that we would be proud of, that we would like to play ourselves. Then we came to our shareholders because we were on the stock exchange, and we said, we'd like to focus on the horror. We'd like to become one of the best developers of psychological horror in the world. They replied, okay, sure, this is a good idea. We'll support you. They gave us money, actually more than we expected, but we lowered our numbers to what just we needed at the time. When reflecting on themselves, they actually had 2 games in mind, and most surprisingly of all, Layers of Fear wasn't their first choice. The Medium was an idea in which they conceived by their boss years before Bloober Team was even created, but they kept shelving it because they never thought that the technology was advanced enough to have 2 screens on display at the same time. With that idea out of the way, they therefore went with what ended up becoming Layers of Fear. It was also a natural start for them as most of them had a master's degree in art. It's only fitting that they would therefore make a game about a painter walking the fine line between madness as so many others have done in the past. Before we go any further and I start analyzing the game more properly, I would like to start by clarifying a few things. The first one is directly linked with a misinterpretation of their horror. Bloober Team strongly believes that they created a new kind of psychological horror to which they've dubbed hidden horror. Their thesis works under 2 principles. The first one is that mainstream elements of horror, like blood and gore and monsters and everything of a sorts, aren't shown directly to the player. They believe that those things aren't as scary as exploring the unknown of the human condition. It feeds on that primitive fear of the unknown and on the bastardization of the other core rights of man. Altogether, it creates a game which feels personal in a way. These are games where immersion is the main factor, and every little detail serves that narrative. That's also why they strongly believe that the scariest thing for any human being is experiencing someone else's traumas and being in the shoes of a person to which, in normal circumstances, we wouldn't want to be. That's why all of their games have subjects like mental illnesses, emotional dilemmas, and controversial topics in the core of their stories, which causes a lot of controversy in the fan base. I will get into that topic more by the end of the video, but just know that I'll be representing it in this video in the same light as the game is in order to be faithful to the vision of the artist. This vision doesn't necessarily coincide with mine, but I'll do my best to explain myself once we've reached that point in the video. The second main principle that goes hand in hand with their thought process is the idea that everything needs to serve the core element or message being explored in the game. In Layers of Fear, it was the long-lasting dilemma of what's more important to you, your job or your family? Can you have both without sacrificing the success of another? When you examine the world that we live in, you'll often see that most paying jobs are also the ones requiring a lot of time. In the video game industry, for example, crunch culture is a very present phenomenon. Working 6, sometimes even 7 days a week for a very long period of time makes it hard for people to prioritize their family life. Mix in the stress from work and peer-to-peer pressure from other workers, and you'll end up with a lot of employees suffering from burnout or just straight up quitting the industry altogether. The point of Bloober Team is to create stories where people can relate to themselves and others, and it's those moments that scare us, make us feel vulnerable, but at the same time can offer a very personal and unique experience. It's with that kind of lens that we need to examine all of their games, including this one. Overall, that means that it's less about the visuals and more about what it represents. Why was it done the way that it was? And how does it make you feel during the whole encounter? As the title suggests, fear has multiple layers of varied depth, and it's by paying attention to them that we get to better understand them when the time comes. The second thing worth mentioning here is that I'll be analyzing the game as a whole instead of making a linear walkthrough. I decided to tailor my script for the game because it's very repetitive by nature, and it's made in a way where the feeling you get from playing it is more important than the gameplay itself. It plays with the same basic gimmick during each level, so in order for this video to be less redundant, I decided to adapt the script and make something more fast-paced and center on its analysis. My end goal is to create a complimentary video that gives you a better understanding of the hidden things of the game so that you may better understand it and appreciate it when you actually decide to play it. The third thing that I want to mention is that I originally owned the game on Xbox One, so I naturally decided to record from there, but I had forgotten just how atrocious the frame rate and the screen tearing is. So I decided afterwards to buy the game on PC because, you know, if I'm gonna do this video, I might as well just do it properly, right? That being said, most of the visuals will come from the PC version, but I'll still splice out some Xbox footage here and there because I did finish the game twice on Xbox, and I don't feel like replaying the whole game in its entirety just to get the different endings and other small details alike. Lastly, the next segment goes over the intro in the first chapter of the game with the goal of immersing us, giving us some much needed context for the basic mechanics. I'll also contextualize and analyze the paintings that I find of importance to the general feel of the experience. Overall, it will help us better understand the hidden context, which eludes the player because the game doesn't explain why those paintings are the way that they are. So unless you're actively searching for them, you just won't be able to understand their meaning. If what I just mentioned doesn't interest you for whatever reason, you may just skip to this part of the video where I start analyzing the game as a whole, slowly leading to my overall conclusion. Hey, so before we actually get into this video, this is me during the editing phase. I have finished the video, I showed it to a couple of my friends, and it seems that my pronunciation is horrible. Do excuse me in advance for some of these, because to be quite honest, these names are very hard to tell. Regardless, I just don't want anyone to get frustrated on me because I am trying my best. I'm fully sorry, and without any further ado, now let's actually get into this video.
I know how you must feel. Lost. Alone. Hopeless. You probably deserve it. But even for you, there is still a way. A way to bring it all back. The one precious thing you ever truly desired. Finish it.
Our protagonist enters what seems like an entryway to his home. We can see two paintings on the wall. The one on the left depicts the famous Rembrandt painting called The Abduction of Ganymede, also known as The Rape of Ganymede. It represents the eagle of Zeus, or sometimes even Zeus himself, depending on the interpretation, seizing Ganymede and bringing him to Olympus in order to become the cupbearer of the gods and lover of Zeus. Many reiterations have been done to this particular scene, but what separates Rembrandt's version from the other ones is that this scene is depicted during the flight. We can witness the fear in his eyes while the hawk mercilessly clenches the young Ganymede. The white tones clash with the obscurity of the bird, thus depicting a contrast between the child's innocence and the beast's animosity. Also, in case you haven't realized, he's depicted as a child and is supposed to serve Zeus some drinks and offer him some services passionately. Man, times have really changed, huh? The painting on the right is the first painting of a series of 3, which were made by Augustus Leopold Egg, called The Past and the Present. This painting represents the dramatic scene of the husband discovering that his wife had cheated on him. This was painted during the 1860s, which means that divorce wasn't accepted socially and no mercy was shown to the lady. I know that it's hard to see, but the man is stepping on the miniature portrait of the lady, signifying that he's severing ties with her, all of which has been witnessed by the innocent eyes of their daughters, hopefully unaware of what's to come. Lastly, we can see an open door in the window, which suggests that the lady will be banished from their lives forever. If you thought that that scene was depressing, the second painting shows the daughters, now grown up, mourning the death of their father many years later. The last painting represents the fate of the late mother, seamlessly sleeping or dead under a bridge as an itinerant while holding an urchin child in her arms. Quite a set of dramatic scenes to adorn the entrance of her home, don't you think? I mean, I myself possess somewhat of an acquired taste in decoration, but definitely not the same tone as represented in the game. However, in this context, it works actually pretty well, as it sets what's gonna happen, and even if you have no idea what you're looking at, as I did during the many years of me playing this game, I can still feel the gist of it, as these paintings have a strong aura to them. They make you feel sad, alone, and overall unpleasant, and those feelings really persist throughout the experience. We open a door and are greeted by a luxuriously decorated interior. A big open room with a lot of details on the walls and furniture really hammer the protagonist's success in his endeavors. You can clearly see the upper class references, which also explain why he possesses 2 renowned paintings in his entryway. We interact with the letter on the table in front of us and find out that he's been pestering a rodent extermination company. They confirm that he doesn't have any rats in the house and that every visit ended up futile and a total waste of time on their part. They also demand that he ceases to send them hate mail and that, if he persists, he will be summoned to court by their lawyers. Continuing the exploration of the area, we open a display case and find a weirdly scratched picture of 2 men shaking hands while a bunch of paintings scattered in a room behind them. The picture seems to have been taken during a big event, as it becomes evident that a big opening or a conclusion of a big sale had taken place. Having the man scratched out could symbolize a bad omen of sorts, or that he's no longer the man he once was. Next to the picture is a door with some paint on it, and an anonymous note stating that he should stop losing his key if he doesn't want other people to snoop inside. The person who wrote the letter, which seems to be a maid when further examining the language used, has left a key in his office for him to reclaim at his earliest convenience. Going back to the front of the room, we can see a big dog collar on the table. It's pretty weird that it's just chilling there for no reason, because we haven't seen any proof that there's any animals in the house, and while you mention it, place seems abandoned as well. We enter the kitchen and we witness numerous wine bottles shattered on the floor. The kitchen is spacious and the still life with fruit painting by Antonio de Pereda y Salgado hangs on the wall. A message was left on the table stating that someone left us food and that we should take a break from time to time. This letter was clearly written by our love interest, which means that our character probably has a wife. It also has an undertone of neglect, which is a recurring theme of the game. Let's just hope that it's actually work and not a bunch of drunken charades, even if the shattered bottles beg to differ. We exit the room and head to the closet located next to the bathroom. We open the lights and look on the floor. Damn, son, either the exterminators are scamming him crazy, or he's ridiculously paranoid. Probably the second option though, as there are so many of them around the room and none of them have bait attached to them. We leave the closet and enter the bathroom where the water tap has been left running in the dirty sink. We also find an inked receipt stating that someone has received a baloney prosthetic with a handwritten comic at the bottom of the paper stating that they've messed up big time. Overall, when you add in the heavy atmosphere caused by the rain and thunder, you get to create in your mind a portrait of a miserable or dysfunctional family. One where the father neglects his loved ones and hangs creepy paintings with his above. What's also noticeable is that we have proof that other people live with us, but we're the only ones breaking the silence. So what happened to everyone else? We go up the stairs and get to admire more bizarre paintings like Salvador Rosa's landscape with Tobit and the Angel, Finding Putti by Guido Reni, and so many more. The creepiest of all, in my opinion, will be the Francesco Goya painting called Tio Paquete. Even if his expression is charismatic, it just makes me feel so uncomfortable. What's peculiar is that it's actually somewhat of a portrait of a blind beggar that would sit on the steps of the San Felipe El Real church, where he would sing, play the guitar, and beg. Fascinated by the man, Francesco decided to immortalize him with this piece, and I wonder what his opinion would be if he could actually see it. We finish climbing the stairs and reach another open room where a piano rests on the right with a set of chairs defining the common area. Between the two is the famous Domenico Fetti painting called The Repentant Saint Mary Magdalene. It's the portrait of Mary Magdalene, a sinner who hasn't followed the teachings of God and therefore became a symbol of the sacrament of penance. She's holding a skull in her hand, which may now seem macabre for her standards, but at the time represented her mortality and the fact that she will one day leave the human planes of existence and move on to the realm of the dead where she'll be judged for her transgressions. We move closer to the piano and we can see that there's a stack of burned music sheets on the piano for some reason. We turn right and head towards the room with a note requesting that no one disturbs his slumber as he's been working all night and desperately needs his rest. We enter the room regardless and found a well-kept room with the main point of interest being a shattered mirror. We can pick up another piece of burnt paper on the counter and discover that it's an extract from a newspaper mentioning a fire that happened in a department store where several people were injured in the ordeal. On the other side of the bed, there's a wine bottle, a cane next to the closet, and a note on the nightstand stating that he couldn't sleep because his leg was acting. He therefore decided to go back to work. We leave the room and enter the small corridor on the right, where we'll find a door covered in what seems like some kind of black ink. The door is locked and the ink is reflectant, so it might rather be spilled wine instead of the ink. I'm not really sure, to be quite honest. On the other side of the room, there's a slightly lit room which belongs to a young child. Crayons are scattered all over the floor. Dolls and plushies are on the shelves with a small wooden soldier on the bed. I really wonder where everyone left off, as every room that we enter seems to be frozen in time for some reason. It's just very peculiar. We leave the room and enter the last room on the left, which ends up being our office. Big and spacious with a lot of bookshelves. It's actually pretty impressive how his office is bigger than my basement. Behind his desk is the portrait of a hairy person that I always thought was a painting that was made for the game. You later find an article in his office that states that the painting was in some sort of exhibition in which critics hated it. It also seems so out of place when compared with the other paintings we've seen. So imagine my surprise when I did my research for this video and discovered that not only was this painting made in 1595 by Lavinia Fontana, but that it's actually a portrait of a real person. Yeah! A real person. I can't believe it myself, honestly. Long story short, her given name of the person on the painting was Antonieta Gonzalez, and her biological father was Petrus Gonsalvus. Oh my god, so many complicated names. And her biological father was Petrus Gonsalves. Her father, herself, two other sisters, and a family relative suffer from a rare disease called hypertrichosis, or werewolf syndrome in more common terms. It's a genetically transmitted disease that makes the person have an abnormally intense spike in hairness in either a specific part of the body or, in her case, all over her body. It is rumored that she was less than 10 years old when that portrait was made, so imagine the bullying she must have endured all her life. I especially love how captivating her look is, and the dev must have felt the same way, as there's a secret achievement that requires you to look at the painting for a total of 5 minutes. I always somehow liked the painting, and I now have an even bigger appreciation for it. It's pretty cool what you can find when you take the time to research random things when making a video. Once we're done admiring the portrait, we can turn around and read a note in the drawer written by a book publisher. It contains the words of a distressed man questioning the sanity of the protagonist. He simply can't fathom how a simple job like drawing pictures for a child's book about Red Riding Hood can end up, and I quote, demented nightmare fuel. Setting the note aside, we can actually look at the drawings and well, that's exactly what you would expect if you ever read one of the stories of the Grimm brothers. Although I do have to be fair here, the drawings are actually pretty fucking cool. I would actually like a book with those. We set the drawings back on the desk and grab the key on the right side of the table. We can also grab a note next to it to find more proof that he's neglected his family. With all the rooms explored, we head back downstairs and unlock the room to the art studio. It's surprisingly clean with some misplaced items here and there, but not as bad as I expected it to be. We have a duplicate of the Redburn painting located next to a bunch of collectibles that I've picked up on my previous playthroughs. Curiosity takes over as we get closer to the canvas and interact with the drapes covering it, and this is the moment where the game actually begins. Now, every chapter starts off the same way. We unveil the painting and head towards the exit. The door is always framed the same way, with Hieronymus Bosch's painting called Hell located on the left, and Francesco Goya's brigand murdering a woman on the right. There's a message appearing above the door, giving us a hint of what's to come. We open the door, which now leads to a new corridor that we haven't seen before. We open the door at the end of the room, and we arrive in front of an open window. Some words are written on the wall at the other side of the window, so we get closer to get a better look at it. We look around and realize that we hit a dead end. On the wall is the same painting that we saw next to the exit. What's interesting about this painting is that the devs actually cropped it. This is the original painting, and as you can see, it has way more to offer those that dare gaze into hell itself. Or that's what Bosch wanted you to think. Can you see where the two characters are located on the painting? I'll give you some time, so if you want to play with Charlie, just pause this video and look at it. But if not, here's the counter. So 3, 2, 1. And the answer is actually right there at the bottom right. I don't really know what it represents as I wasn't able to find much, but the Met Museum website states the details of the scene associated with Judas somehow. What I do know is that this painting depicts a lot of scenes from the Bible. On the left side, we can see God opening the gates of hell and in essence, rescuing the souls of the just. Adam and Eve are kneeling at the extremity of a tower, and behind them, we have a bunch of people from the Old Testament climbing the steps of hell, with Noah holding a replica of the ark. Overall, it represents the hardship of hell, while also representing hope and salvation. My favorite part is actually the house in the shape of a face, with the mouth being a passageway to hell. I just love the juxtaposition of the whiteness of the face with the characters around it. It really makes them pop, and it helps build a sense of curiosity. There's so much happening in this piece that you literally have to look at everything, inch by inch, and that's a rare feat to come by. We keep looking around the room, and we can't find an exit of any kind. We therefore go through the same door that we used to get in, only to discover that it leads to another corridor entirely. Anthony Shunyan's self-portrait welcomes us as we enter the room. We also verified the door that we used to get there, and it's magically locked somehow. We find another duplicate of the Madeline painting, and we turn right to find one of Goya's paintings, The Witches of Sabah. We enter the next room only to find another dead end. We're greeted with more duplicate paintings, with the only new one being the Judith slaying Holophant by Artemisia Gentileschi. This. It depicts a scene from the apocryphal book of Judith in the Old Testament, where Judith assassinates the drunken Assyrian general with the aid of her maidservant Abra. It's a really nice painting overall, but man does it paint a very depressing image, especially when you place it next to all the other paintings that we've seen so far. It really makes you question why our protagonist is so obsessed with death and the suffering that it ensues. Next to the painting is a locked box that requires a combination to pry open. We look around the room and open the drawers, but no solutions are visible. The unique mechanic of the game is that it uses environmental storytelling to tell its tutorial, and therefore you need to explore unconventional means in order to find what you seek. In this case, if you go to the corner of the room and light the candles, the paintings will melt, revealing the desired sequence. We enter the combination and open the box, only to find our wife's wedding ring. By interacting with it, we get to experience how the story is told.
The thought alone that the most beautiful piece of art doesn't have my name on it is killing me. So, will you marry me?
Afterwards, we turn around and the door magically appears behind us. All that serves to make us understand the main concept of the game. We're playing as someone who's lost touch with reality, which means that nothing we see is truly real. Paintings repeat, random doors connect, messages are scribbled on the wall and furniture because he's lost touch with the world around him. His mind uses whatever he may remember or see in order to attempt to make sense of the world around him. That's also why you need to dig deeper and analyze what's happening in order to understand the state that our protagonist is in. Here's another example that goes hand in hand with this idea. I've played this game so many times in the past, and I never realized that there was a hidden door in the wall that leads to a totally optional room. I personally really like the idea that opening a drawer leads you to an even smaller closed drawer every time. It's cool and it's very surprising the first time you interact with it. By opening the wall, it fades only to reveal a deer in which you can pull the tongue. Do it once and it becomes sentient, pushing you back and placing itself back in a position where you can redo the whole experience. Do it once more and the deer vanishes, changing the layout of the room and allowing you to exit once and for all. What I really love with this room is that it's totally missable, but when found, adds to the dreary feeling that we're slowly losing our minds, and I think that's pretty cool. We leave the room and enter the next one, only to find the same deer head that we just saw. We also realize that there's a doll stuck in a frame, so we head towards it only for our expectations to be subverted. We fell through a trapdoor somehow, and therefore ended up in what I presume is the basement. I head towards the stairs and activate the light switch, only to turn around and get greeted by another weird phenomenon. We walk a little further until we open a door that leads us to a long corridor decorated with some peculiar paintings. They've been juxtaposed with another painting, making them look smushed and somewhat disturbing. We can rotate the painting and find another memento from our past.
Now, a tiny bit to the left. Yes, just like that. Hold that pose. I want to get all those lovely curves just right.
We enter the next room and start hearing the squeaking of mice or rats, but no matter how much you may search for it, you simply won't be able to find the source, We get closer to the painting at the end of the room and the subject leaks itself out of existence. We can also see that the painting on the right has also changed for something that looks like a bunch of hanging ghosts. We then head back to the same room we came from and the layout changed again. We can now hear a person crying on the other side of the locked door. In front of said room is another interactable memento from our wife, which means that she's probably the person crying in the next room.
Hello. It's about time for us to talk, don't you think? I mean, I've seen you in my house so many times, and yet I could never find the courage to face you directly. Not until now.
The room after this one leads us to a slightly demolished storage with broken walls and bottles making most of the scenery. The next door leads us to another corridor which subsequently leads us to the kitchen. Everything looks more or less as previously, which is weird considering that every room so far had some anomaly in it one way or another. Both doors are locked and nothing is really happening, so we start pacing around the room and interacting with all the drawers that cross our path. At one point, we see a rotten fruit of sorts come out of the painting. Knocking is heard on the door, so we walk towards it only to discover that the exit has been bricked off, while a knife is thrown our way. We turn around and get closer to the painting as the light dims, showcasing what follows next.
First, I looked for a canvas. Not just any canvas. I had to find a knife. Not one of those bread ones. It needed to be as sharp as a razor. So I used a razor, in fact, and then carefully flayed the skin. Booze helped keep my hand steady.
Superficially, this is a really cool and unexpected effect. They took a real painting and created another one empty of all substances just to really hammer in what just happened. But I think that it does something even more genius, which is to indirectly symbolize his fall from grace. He's used up all of his life's fortune and currently doesn't have anything left, which would go hand in hand with the picture we found earlier, as well as with every other weird thing that just found while exploring the house. The way back is now unlocked, so we exit the room and end up back into our workhouse. We use the skin that we collected on the painting, and we get this really cool transition signifying the end of the chapter. The display case next to us opens a drawer, revealing the skin that we got, which means that we'll be collecting more of these items as the game goes on. It also serves another purpose, which is to give a clear idea of the story progression, while allowing us to keep tabs of our descent of madness. Every chapter ends with us picking up a body component and using it on a painting in order to make it shift into something entirely different. The second chapter ends with us picking up a vial in which we siphon blood into it. The third chapter ends with us picking up some powdered bones, and the fourth gives us a new brush, so to speak. It's really creepy, and as the gameplay intensifies, so do the components we collect, and that alone is unique and separates this game from all others. I can't think of another game that took this approach even to this day. It's really fun just seeing how the painting morphs over time. It sets a clear pacing to the missions, and it rewards fits with the idea in play. More importantly, it helps add credibility to the gameplay. It's so psychedelic by nature that it helps us better accept the feelings of distress and confusion that we feel during the gameplay segments, while also adding credibility to his profession. What's also interesting is that you've also seen most of the tricks that the devs use to confuse and scare the player. There's nothing new added to the mix, and you may think that it's not enough for the whole duration of the game, but you would be wrong to assume that. What's cool here is that they tried to use the same tricks, but show them in different ways as often as possible, and for the most part they actually succeeded. We're constantly being moved from room to room, and it's still impressive even after playing the game for so long, because you don't see the rooms load or change around you. You just happen to turn the camera and you end up in another room entirely. The paintings also distort and become messier the further you advance in the story. Dolls will be copy pasted all over the place, creating a demonic feeling to the whole experience, which then escalates and becomes something else entirely. Naming all the ways to play with the dynamic of the room would be redundant, but the important thing to know is that not all of them serve to only jump scare the player or make him feel a very specific emotion. Sometimes they use those same elements to make us experience and understand what the protagonist is going through. The second chapter references multiple times the fire that happened previously, and after showing it to us, they give us a puzzle with a vinyl player. We essentially need to play it backwards in order to destroy the room, giving it a very burned and deformed look to the surroundings. Then, in order to put it all back the way it was, we have to play the vinyl normally, and it all shapeshifts back in real time, which is so satisfying to watch. The third chapter makes a lot of references to his wife, and this is also the chapter where we'll find the burned music sheet that we found previously, which now holds a memento for some reason. We also find a painting depicting her playing the piano, and I think it gives her some glamour. I think it captures the way that he sees her, which makes us relate to him in a more direct way. Also, in case you were wondering, this is also a real painting. It's called Mrs. Meg's Playing with the Grand Piano by William Merritt Chase. More importantly, the devs take this symbolism even further because we get to see the piano in motion at the end of the chapter. The music is so calming and beautiful, and seeing everything in the air really creates this zen feeling that helps us relate to the protagonist because it's impossible to deny the beauty on display. Maybe a little too much so, as when she hits the wrong notes, all the objects fall on the ground, breaking the harmony of the scene and irritating us in the process. Overall, it really gives this game a very experimental feel, more so than their other games actually. It really feels like they wanted to keep the game as simple as possible, and therefore try to find original ways that they could implement the few mechanics that they had in hand. That's also why this game is more of a walking simulator than their other games, because what you saw so far is essentially what you get throughout the whole experience. Normally, the walking simulator stamp would be a negative thing, like giving a game a badge of shame, so to speak, but I think that because of the themes, the story, the presentation, and the charm of its simplicity, it's actually able to turn it around and wear it as a positive instead. I mean, what better way is there to experience madness, fear, distress, sadness, loneliness, and self-destruction than by creating a walking simulator where everything is tailored around the player, showing you those ideas and is able to make you feel when it desires you to feel it. What also helps is the game's short length. It takes around 3.5 hours to finish it, so there's enough happening to keep you invested while also ending before it becomes too much. What also complements the presentation is the story itself. Every character has a common theme that sets the tone and kind of events that you'll encounter. The first chapter was all about the life that he had before he lost everything to the event to come. We found out that he was happily married, enjoyed his wife's company, and thought that she was the most beautiful person in the world. It's also the chapter that starts to spiral into madness, which is why all of the changes are subtle and hints towards what's to come, unlike later chapters where everything is questioned, even our own existence. The second chapter is all about the different things that started his downfall. We learned that the fire happened in the convenience store, and his wife suffered severe burns that left her permanently damaged in her skin and nervous system. We also get more confirmation that she was a really good musician that inspired him and therefore encouraged him to make art. Unfortunately, because her nerves are damaged, she couldn't even play her instruments, and ended up on a wheelchair, which are the main reasons why he lost interest in her over time. He loved her for her looks and talent, and as an upcoming Mozart, so to speak. So when both traits were banished from her, he fell into despair and therefore resorted to alcoholism, which in turn brought more problems. Speaking of our characters, he was also the one that had the knee surgery that got butchered, therefore resorting to the cane for the rest of his life, which also diminishes his morale. Chapter 3 is a direct continuation of those events, but escalates it, showing us the exact moments they found out about the incident. This is also where the ghost of his wife haunts him, hinting at the cruel reality that gets revealed later on. It's also important to mention that the closer you get to the reality of things, the more the rooms start making less sense, becoming messier, and it gets subsequently covered by ink. Kind of like a metaphor of sorts. Chapter 4 is all about their daughter and how they were treating her during the whole ordeal. Yeah, imagine having a daughter through this whole experience. Like, just mind-blowing. Imagine all the psychological drama that the kid must have. Which is also why they decided to make the DLC, which I'll get into a little bit later in the video. More importantly, we get to see the abuse firsthand with the drawing that appears all over the place. We get to see it animated, giving us a glimpse of her mental psyche, which is what I hinted at previously. Additionally, we learned that her father would hit her and then buy her dolls to compensate, which is why we see a bunch of them hunting us. Overall, it all hints to a very dysfunctional family, but it doesn't go into great detail as the game never deviates from its main character. That's why the devs made a DLC where we get to learn what happened to her and why the mother is only covered from his point of view. And that's also why we're getting a game from the mother's perspective, which is supposed to complete the story and close the chapter for good. On a side note, I actually sort of think that they're trying to milk the license here, as I don't see the necessity for a new game in this timeline. Their story is complete as is, and I don't know what else you could actually add, but I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Now I'm going to talk about the end phase, all 3 endings, and explain the story, so warning spoilers from here on out, although I do strongly believe that this is one of those rare moments where the experience of playing it is more important than what actually happens in it. Also, because the game is told with the use of missable collectibles, it may be hard to follow the story at times, so I'll leave it up to you if you want to hear the next part. Do skip to this part in the video if you want to hear my reflection on the game and what could be used for the remake of Silent Hill 2. But if you do decide to quit the video, I do understand, so thank you for watching up until now, and the rest of you, let's just keep going and get into the story. The common concepts that persist in environmental storytelling is that the closer he gets to completing his painting, the closer he gets to ruining everything around him. Walls get demolished, room sizes changed, and becomes surreal at times. Black ink covers the walls and plagues the rooms. The ghostly apparition becomes a more common occurrence, and more violence is indirectly suggested until the protagonist passes out, and we get the big reveal at the end. We get to see things how they really are. Everything around has been destroyed and overall ravaged in one way or another. The splendor from the beginning is now contrasted by the destruction of everything, and I mean everything that he owned and loved. A metaphor for his state of mind, so to speak. It also recontextualizes all past events because at one point, you start becoming numb to the changes made to the world. You get used to the jump scares, the twitching of characters, the never-ending rooms that surround us, and it's therefore easy to forget that this is all happening to a real person inside of a real house, or, you know, to the very least, it feels real to him. That's why I love this end segment, as it brings it all back and confirms that he was having a destructive breakdown that affected the world around him. It also begs the question as to where the body piece is actually real, and does the painting actually exist if most of it was forged by desperation of the mind? Well, in order to answer those questions, I'll have to explain the narrative in a more chronological order. Our protagonist, known only as the painter, was a famous artist that lived off his craft and made a substantial living out of it. He married an upcoming musician and they both lived happily together. She also got an unplanned pregnancy but decided to keep the child, and that's when they decided to officially move in together. Years later, he got his knee surgery and had a hard time walking around the house. During the adjustment phase, his wife had the misfortune of being severely damaged by the department store fire. That left her severely disfigured, temporarily crippled, and worse still, she damaged her nerves, which made it impossible for her to play music anymore. Horrified, he tried finding anyone that could help fix her, but technology wasn't really at that level at the point, and therefore help never came. That means that she would never get better, and that weighed on him severely. He would shut himself in his studies for days, neglecting his wife and daughter. He would miss all big events and would obsess over his art, but as his mind wasn't in a healthy state, his art suffered as a result. The frustration that came from his failure as an artist and towards his powerlessness in regards to his wife transformed him into an alcoholic with random bursts of verbal and physical violence. He would transmit this frustration on his family and in the correspondences they would have with the outside world. His wife, by contrast, felt life slipping away, and because the only friend that she had was now repulsed by her, she started believing him and resenting him for it. She would respond in a similar aggressive nature, which became a spiral of neglect and verbal abuse. With each passing day, she became more and more jealous of his paintings, stating that he loved them more than he loved her, which led her to, well, take her own life. As an act of desperation, he decided to use her body to paint her essence in his paintings, hoping that it would bring her back to life, so to speak, kind of like the Dorian Gray movie, which heavily inspired the game. That's why everything starts and ends with a painting. If he's successful, he's hoping that he'll be able to get her back and able to recapture what made him such a legendary artist to begin with. But of course, the real question now is, how can you capture perfection when it's unreachable? Well, that's why the easiest ending showcases him being haunted by his failed paintings, only to have him get discouraged and start another painting, restarting this cycle once more. There are also 2 other endings in the story, and that's where your in-game choices come into play. The game doesn't really explain this to you, but the mementos you pick up and the way that you treat your wife's apparition will determine what kind of ending you get. If you act selfishly and mostly pick up the memories which center around him while simultaneously avoiding the wife, he ends up converting the painting of his wife into a self-portrait. By letting go of his past life, he is able to move on and regain his success. I believe that's why there are a lot of self-portraits in the house. They represent the self-centered nature of the artist, and in his regard, the selfishness that he feels towards his craft, which is why the only ending where he survives sees him getting back on his feet while his mind loses down-to-earth capabilities. The opposite is also true, where if you run towards your late wife and pick up the mementos with her and your daughter, he ends up making a successful painting of them, the first of its kind. He then brings it upstairs and realizes that painting them won't bring them back, so he takes the impulsive decision of setting everything including himself on fire. That is also the canon ending, and I think that you can see the issue that arises with those endings. This game is centered around mental illnesses and what happens when someone doesn't get the treatment it requires. When the game teaches you that no help can be given to you and that your only options are to either die or become a selfish prick, well, you can imagine why a lot of people boycott Bloober Team in general. These themes are often utilized in their games, and a lot of people feel like they're done in bad taste. If you want a good example of a game that did these themes a million times more disturbingly while succeeding in passing a positive message, then go and play Martha is Dead. Also, on a side note, I am working on a video on Martha is Dead, so do like and subscribe if you want to see it in the future. Granted, I don't think that this issue is as big here as it is for their other games because of the game's setting and gameplay mechanics. The game is set in a time where talking about those problems isn't as accepted as it is now. He also sent a bunch of hate mail to anyone that disappointed him, so it's easier to accept the idea that he has nowhere else to turn. The game also doesn't go for that kind of realism, so it's not that big of an issue as it was for the Medium, for example. But it also doesn't help that the problem is made bigger with the daughter's story. In the main game, we learn that she was neglected by both parents and that her father tried to raise her to become his heir, and I'm sure you know where this is going. He was demanding and strict, and that really made her unhappy. Her unhappiness led him to buy her new dolls every time, which is why there are so many in the house and why they stalk us in the main campaign. She also wanted a cat as a pet, but her dad decided to randomly buy her a dog, which led her to developing a fear of dogs, ironically enough. And honestly, that's about it for the core game, which is why a DLC was released to flesh out the story. We learned in that DLC that a social worker took her away and was subsequently adopted by her foster family. As a grown-up, she comes back to the house to pick up her inheritance, hence why the name of the DLC. Needless to say, all 3 endings of hers are horrible. After reliving the memories of her childhood, she either forgives her father and decides that the way that he acted around her was acceptable, making her act the same way towards her own child. If she ends up not forgiving him, rubble falls on top of her, killing her on impact. But if you collect all the collectibles in the game and complete some other extra side quests, she finds out that her father hid a message in their drawings, which makes her discover an empty canvas. She then decides to take over his legacy, which leads us to presume that insanity runs in the family. The problem with this DLC is that it teaches us that no matter how much the circumstances change, you'll always end up the same way as your parents, and honestly, that's not a message that resonates with a lot of people. What resonates with me the most is the balance between work and family. I have a full-time job and my videos take about more or less 100 hours to make, which is why that most of my free time gets invested in my projects. I also live with my spouse, I'm pretty close to my immediate family, and have a few friends that I hold dear, so I can't imagine how hard it can be sometimes when you have this much happening on a regular basis. In other words, it's that in unequal balance that scares me, and this game captures that fear pretty well. It acts more like a warning that I'm trying desperately to avoid at all costs. I also know that I'm not the only person who feels this way. I read in an interview that the lady was able to understand why her husband divorced her 10 years prior just by experiencing the game for herself. In a world where people work a lot and have less and less time for their loved ones, what do you do when all you have left is your neglected self? The self that's slowly slipping away and becoming the shadow that you've avoided confronting for so long. That's why I love this game regardless of all its faults, and why I love Bloober Team as a whole, as I'm able to relate to the ideas portrayed in the game. For someone that believes that his strongest asset is the strength of his mind, damaging it in any way becomes the thing that scares me the most. But the opposite is also true. If you can't relate or aren't looking for ways to find something you like in their games, you'll end up hating the experience. Superficially, it's a walking simulator with a lot of repeating assets, standardly cheap or annoying jump scares, with a convoluted story that only makes sense when you search for ways to learn it. It's indeed a game that has aged poorly, since these kinds of games are less and less appreciated, but I still see this game in a unique light. Most games make me feel something and then I just move on and, you know, the feeling diminishes, but very rarely do I play something that makes me reflect on myself, and I think that for that reason they deserve all the praise that I can give them. With all that being said, what is my take on the game when I reflect over the Silent Hill IP? Well, obviously it's a little too early to say anything because it is indeed their first game in their horror portfolio, but I think that we can all agree that they know how to create atmosphere with very few game mechanics. It also takes a lot of guts to go from basement brawl and put your work into creating a new IP, which still feels unique to this day. That tells me that they're willing to put the necessary work into creating something worthy when they're emotionally invested in what they're doing, and for this project, they definitely are. There are a lot of interviews where they mention indirectly that they would like to work on the Silent Hill IP, and they seem to be the type to also be influenced by the license. So overall, I'm actually not worried about that front. On the other hand, Layers of Fear has zero combat and tells its story okay at best and poorly at worst. The story for Silent Hill 2 is a colossal feat, and I don't think that they know how to pull it off. As short and effective as it is at picking up mementos, it doesn't really immerse the player in the story as well as cutscenes do. Thankfully for them, they've announced that they're not remixing the story or adding new components to it whatsoever. All they want to do is bring the classic to modern times, which means upgrading the graphics, upgrading the combat and the game mechanics without actually modifying the story whatsoever. With what we've seen so far, I think that it's probably the best thing that they could have done in this situation. But on the flip side, I've also played this game so many times, I know most of everything by heart, and I've seen so many videos on the subject that I don't see the point of replaying the game if it's gonna feel the same way, because I would just rather play the original game at that point. But you know, that's just me, right? One thing's for sure though is that we still have a long list of games to talk about, so I want to thank you for getting to the end of my video. I hope that you have a fun time and that you've learned something new. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already, and I hope that you'll join me on the next episode where I'll be covering my favorite game in this lineup of games, the famous and best regarded game that they made so far, The Observer.